I'm going to show you how you can make $1 million in real estate in just 18 months. This isn't a theoretical scenario either. This is a real, live, listed deal. The best part about this deal is that it's listed directly on LoopNet, so it doesn't require any advanced subscription or broker contacts. It's also not in a big competitive city. It's in a town of just 30,000, which means there's minimal competition. This is a deal that truly anyone has access to, even if you're just a beginner. If you're not familiar with LoopNet, it's basically a listing platform for commercial real estate, similar to what Zillow does for residential real estate. This deal is too small for me now. I run my own real estate private equity firm, and the deals I just closed on in Q4 were $16 million and $8 million. But I'm going to show you exactly how I find, underwrite, and manage a deal like this to make roughly $1 million in profit in just 18 months. So this is what a typical LoopNet listing looks like. You basically have kind of basic details up top, the purchase price, the number of units, some pictures, and then the executive summary down here. You can see here, this is family owned and operated. It's actually never had an institutional owner. That's really important. Obviously, it's way easier to find a deal from someone who doesn't really know what they're doing. They're unsophisticated rather than institution. So that's really good. You'd see here, it's 8 2-beds, 8 1-beds, very simple. Not too much going on with this deal, kind of down the fairway multifamily. All right, so the first thing I typically do when I see a listing like this that I think is interesting, and I get into why this listing is interesting, is I'll take a look at these attachments here. Generally, those are kind of documents that the broker finds to be important and is attaching so you can kind of read through before even contacting her or him, in this case, her. We're lucky here in that the attachments are not blocked by an NDA or confidentiality agreement. Sometimes that is the case. If it were the case, I wouldn't be able to share this deal live because I would have signed a document saying that I agree not to share any details. That's not the case here. These documents are publicly available, so I can actually talk about this deal, which makes it great for us. And I put them actually up in these tabs up top. First one is just kind of a map, not too much going on there. Second one is lead-based paint disclosure, really pretty irrelevant. And this one here is a little bit more interesting. This is just a insurance renewal, so that we have that number. We can use that in our underwriting. And lastly here, the income and expenses. This is actually very useful. So a few things you want to look at here. Basically, they include the entire rent roll up top, and then they have the expenses down here, getting you to the kind of total P&L down here. We'll start off with the rent roll. I think this one's very interesting and shows kind of why it's such an interesting opportunity, really because there's so much mismanagement, mainly because it's a family who's unsophisticated, who's operating the asset. And that's why there's so much opportunity here. Something I would point out is basically right here, this 2-bedroom unit is renting for $900, where you have a 1-bedroom unit right next to it renting for $1,200. Obviously, one could be renovated and one couldn't be renovated, but this is pretty rare to see on a property. And kind of shows you that something might be going on. They might not be operating it correctly. You can see across the board, these numbers are really, really widely varied here. And overall, that doesn't happen when you have a building that's being operated correctly. So there's a lot of value to be added here. These rents are also way low for the market, which we'll get into in a second. But whenever you see something like that, where the 2 beds renting for less than the 1 bed, you know that it's being currently mismanaged and there might be an opportunity there. Moving down, you kind of have this miscellaneous income here, washer dryer income. That's fine. We'll just leave that as is. And getting down to the expenses, you'll see that utilities are pretty light. My guess is some of it's tenant paid here. And then you just have roto router and insurance. And obviously that's not your entire expense load. This is a completely comical presentation by the broker and the seller, really, because they approved it. But this is not what your expense load is going to look like. I mean, right here, they actually even have the total wrong, but your expense load is not going to be 18 grand on a P&L that has 185K, right? An asset like this, I'd expect it to operate in kind of the 60 to 70% NOI margin, which means expenses are roughly 30 to 40% of your revenue. That's completely off here. They don't even have property taxes here. They don't have management. They don't really have anything, right? So really no R&M either. So there's a lot missing. We'll get into that in the underwriting. But that's kind of how you look at this immediately and say, all right, the useful thing here is really the rent roll, because that is what it is. So we can use that for the first year of the underwriting to understand kind of what the income is as we come in. But these expenses, we're going to have to change a lot because currently they're completely off. And you can see even here, they say taxes not included. I don't know why you wouldn't include taxes. That's a bit insane. So that's something we'll look at during the underwriting in 1 second. But this is kind of how you want to analyze a rent roll, analyze a P&L, is just kind of get in there, understand what you're working with, understand what information is useful and what you can kind of discard. All right, here we have kind of the basic back of the envelope model. This is what I use kind of as the first cut for any specific deal I'm looking at. Just kind of put it in quickly. And if the numbers work, I'll move it to kind of a more detailed model later on. But for the purposes of what we're looking at here, this kind of works to start out. You can see we have all the assumptions and everything on the left side here. It's a 16 unit deal coming in at 144 a key, stabilizing at 167 a key. That'll be important. I'll kind of talk about that in a second. But we're assuming that we're buying it for the purchase price that they listed it for, 2.3 million. We'll obviously move that around later on if the numbers don't work, but I like kind of starting there just to see if it's a reasonable kind of ask or not. For the renovations, we're going to assume that nothing's been renovated at the property. Right, it's 16 units. We're going to assume it's 20,000 per unit. That gets us to 320K in renovation dollars. That's probably a bit conservative. I would say is typically you'd expect to get this done for kind of around 10 to 15K, but we're going to be conservative here to start out, and we'll kind of edit the numbers a bit and massage them, if you will, later on. Deal cost, we'll say is 50,000, roughly 2%. That should be fine there. So kind of your total sources and uses gets you to 2.7 mil. The equity and debt, we'll kind of ignore that for now, right? That really depends on what the details look like. I'll explain why in a second, but for now, we'll just ignore that because you can kind of move those around later on. Same thing with the debt, we'll ignore that as well. And then you just kind of have your disposition stats here, and we'll go to that at the end. So really what we have is the in-place income. This is exactly what they had in their rent roll. The one thing that did change in our rent roll is they had a super who didn't pay rent at 1,400. We're just going to assume they do pay rent just to make the numbers easy for now, and we'll just include a management fee instead. So should be able to kind of make that easy. We're just backing it out. But that's the only reason for the different numbers there. Then you have the other income, which is just that coin, washer, dryer. And then you do the vacancy. They didn't have any vacancy numbers in theirs. We're going to run at 5%. It's a really tight rental market. So 5% should be good. Property taxes, those kind of are what they are. That was based on their numbers, and we looked it up online as well. You can see that on the county website. Insurance based on their numbers, and you can kind of see it's pretty reasonable too. Insurance, they have basically at roughly 750 a unit, I think. Yeah, 766 a unit. So that's very reasonable there. Management, like I said, we kind of backed into that through that rent roll number of 1,400. We'll change that as we get into our own management, possibly when we buy. Owner electric and owner water, that is just coming from their P&L. So we're kind of trusting them on that. They included a few invoices in the attachments they sent over. Didn't show everything, but we'll assume that's right. A lot of it's tenant paid right now, so we'd have to check on that later. But for now, we're going to go with that. For R&M, just plugging in $8,000 here, which is 500 a unit. We'll probably bump that up on the stabilized basis to roughly 1,000 a unit just to be safe. But they didn't have anything in their numbers there. So as you can see, we've really beefed up the expenses, right? They didn't have property taxes. They didn't have management, right? And they didn't have R&M. So that's a lot there. That's 53 grand that they kind of didn't have. Obviously, the management's a bit different in that you're kind of backing it out. But there are a lot of expenses they were skipping out on that's significant value at kind of a 6.5 cap, 7 cap, whatever you want to call it. So just something to think about. You do have to always watch brokers there. They're not going to include all the expenses up front. You have to be really, really careful and just make sure that you're underwriting everything that needs to be underwritten. Never trust the broker at face value, especially when the margin's that crazy, the NOI margin, which they had a crazy margin there. So just always kind of be careful of that. All right, that gets you kind of total expense load of 72K. So your NOI in the in-place is 119K. Really, really different from what they had. I forgot what their number was. It was like 170K or something. That's not realistic. That's not what's going to happen. You're going to have real expenses. And the bank too, when you get debt, is going to underwrite real expenses. They're not going to underwrite the broker's fake expenses. So every other party is going to need those expenses to be in there. So you need to underwrite them. So that kind of gets you the in-place income here. And that really largely determines your debt. So as of right now, you can see that the DSCR, you can see that cap right here coming in at 5.2. That's not as important. What's important is the DSCR here and the negative cash flow. And the DSCR, the reason why that's so important is that a bank needs a 1.25x in order to give you a loan. They're not going to lend you money if it's beneath that. There are some scenarios where maybe they might if you're kind of a repeat borrower, and there's some other lenders, kind of bridge loans where you can do that. But we're going to assume you need bank debt. So we're going to move that down a bit and see if we can get this to a 1.25x DSCR. So still no there, maybe to 65. So probably 55% or so, 57% or so. That's what we need to reduce the leverage to in order to make this deal work on the in-place. There are other ways of financing the deal. You can go with seller financing, you can do a bridge loan, hard money, kind of lower phases and everything like that. But if you wanted bank debt, you'd have to decrease the leverage here just so you can get that 1.25x on the in-place income. just something to think about there as we move forward. And that's really all you want to think about on the in-place income. The rest of it's really going to be predicated on the stabilized income. For the stabilized income, the first thing we're really looking at here is the rent. So those are just done by rent comps. So for the revenue, the primary way to determine that is with comps. For comps, typically there are a few different ways of actually getting them. The first, and typically probably would say second best actually, is getting them from a broker, right? Getting the actual comps from a broker. Those are closed comps for rental properties, right? So properties that are listed in the area, they were listed for a few months and then they closed. That's perfect. You get them from brokers. Typically, you can get it from the MLS as well. You can get it from CoStar. Generally, that just because you have a comp doesn't mean the process is over. You still need to make sure that comp is correct for the property. And just because a broker sent over a comp doesn't mean it's an accurate comp. It could be completely irrelevant. It could be 2 towns over. It could be a way nicer product, whatever it is. So you still have to analyze the comps, but that is probably I would say the second best way of getting a comp is kind of those closed comps. Third best way is really going in Zillow and apartments.com, which is what we have here, and just looking and seeing what's listed. Really, the best way I think is actually calling up the listings themselves, pretending to be a tenant, and getting the actual numbers that they're renting them for. So I typically do a combination of all these when I'm actually going forward with a deal. In this case, we don't really, it's going to be quicker than that, and I can't really show that whole process on a small video. So I'm just going to go on apartments.com and Zillow and just kind of show you exactly what I see and why it kind of makes sense to pick the rents that I chose. So I ended up choosing $2,200 rents for the 2 beds and $1,900 rents for the 1 beds. As you can see here, the 2 beds in the market are going well above that for newer product. We're not going to hit that. We're not going to go close to that. It's going for above 3,000 for really true new product here. If you look at kind of slightly nicer product that isn't marketed as well, kind of 1,700 space. And if you look here, here's kind of a good example. This is listed at 2,000. This is horrible marketing, horrible pictures, and okay, it's not really fully renovated, but there's some hardwood floors, but you can see the kitchen here isn't renovated. We'll probably be above that. So that's obviously a lot more went into it than just this, but just an example of how you kind of ballpark it. Ended up being at 2,200 there. For the 1 beds, came in at 1,900, and you could see there's a lot of listings here. You could see that the really nice 1 beds are going for like 2,300 or so. We're not going to be there. This isn't a brand new product. This is older product. It's like 60s to 80s build. So you're going to end up with a lower number. Obviously, it's not going to be as low as 1,500. This is garbage product here. But if you look around here at some properties that are pretty decent, 1 bed, 1 bath, 900 square feet, asking 2,100. So it doesn't mean they're going to get it. But this is kind of more along what you think. Ended up being at 1,900 overall. So that's how I came to those numbers. Obviously, the process is way more involved when I'm going through it. And the market rent is always the hardest part of the process to get, but it takes very long to do the right way. So I'm just kind of showing you a snippet here. So going back to the model here, we have our top line rent number, right? You can see here 1,900 for the 1 beds, 2,200 for the 2 beds. Remember, there's exactly 8 of each. So that's kind of how we're getting to that exact number, and we're just multiplying by the number of units. So that's how we're getting there. The other income we're leaving the same as the in-place. Vacancy, we have at 5%, which should be fine for a market like this. Is typically a pretty tight type of market, these smaller towns. Property taxes, we're reassessing. You can see here, basically in Connecticut, it's 70% of the purchase price and then multiplied by the mill rate. It's relatively low mill rate. That'll affect the NOI margin. We'll talk about that in a second. That's a very high NOI margin. Insurance, we're increasing at 10% a year. That's obviously a lot, but insurance costs have run up recently, so we're being safe. Management just running at 5% of revenue. Owner electric and owner water increased at 10% from the previous, just to be safe. R&M, we're going to bump that to 1,000 a unit once again to be safe there. I think 500 is probably a bit light for this type of product right now, and there's a lot of margin in this deal, so typically that ends up kind of coming out somewhere. Landscaping and snow, this one's kind of a placeholder for now. You never know where that's going to come in until you actually get quotes for it, but there's going to be something there. So 5,000 is probably fine. Overall, this gets you to a really high NOI margin, right? 72%. I would say typically you're not going to be there. Really what's driving that is the very high rents. People always look at expenses when they look at NOI margins, but the rents being really high can increase that as well. The rents are very high for this type of product, and the taxes are relatively low. Just because you're actually buying it at a really good price here, and because there's just kind of that 70% allocation. So It's actually way lower than you would think. This is not a typical NOI margin. I would say usually you're looking more at the 50 to 60% range. This happens to be 72, which is very good. But it just goes to show you you'd be stealing the deal for this price. And that's why you actually end up stabilizing it at 10 here, which is obviously very, very good. And that's what makes this deal so attractive, right? It's a 6.5 cap market, call it 7.5 cap market, whatever you want to call it. No one knows exactly what the exit cap's going to be, but you're stabilizing to a 10 with relatively conservative kind of assumptions here. We kind of walked through the renovations being conservative and all that. So we've actually added a lot of buffer on the expenses, way more than they had, the vacancy, everything like that. And we're still stabilizing to a 10. So that's really what makes this deal so attractive, is you have this kind of 350 basis points between the 10% stabilized yield and the exit cap rate of the market. Even if you move that to a 7, it's still $1 million of profit. So this is one of those deals where you can make a lot of money very quickly. It's 16 units. It could be in and out in 18 months. Really 1 unit a month of renovation. You could do it way quicker than that if you want, and end up with a really, really good payday on the deal. So this is one of those you can get in and out of very quickly. That's really what makes it so attractive. I think it ended up going above ask with no contingency is the deal. It already traded, but the person who made it, even who bought it, even if they paid above that, they probably ended up making like 750 on the deal. It was a pretty clear path on this one, and good for them. One final thing I did want to talk about with the profit here is this kind of exit price per unit. This is really high at 260K unit. Just have to be really careful when you start getting up into that size, that kind of like price per pound, just because you can build brand new product for that price. So you're kind of competing against that. So you do want to be really careful on the sale price. Even at a 7 cap, you have to be careful on the sale price here. What I would say is when you stabilize to a 10, the cash flow is incredibly good anyway, and your cash on cash is going to be in the mid high teens. So you should be fine regardless, even if you choose to hold the deal. But there will be some people who are kind of hesitant to buy what you're selling when you go to sell the deal, just because that price per pound is a little bit higher. So it's just something to watch out for there. And you have to watch out for that in a lot of deals, not just this one. The last thing I want to mention that makes this deal interesting is really just the layout of the real estate. This is actually pretty nice real estate overall. I know it doesn't look incredible, but keep in mind it's an older product, and it genuinely is pretty nice. It's typically rare to find something that's this kind of well capped, well maintained, good exterior, good land, everything like that, in these smaller size ranges. So it's a very good product, and that's what made the deal initially very attractive as well, to I'm sure so many people, is that the actual physical bones were very good. And this deal happens to be Connecticut. There are deals like this all across the country. Actually, if someone going through the boot camp right now is closing 2 deals in Connecticut, and really all across the country. So there are deals like this in every single market. This one just happens to be in Connecticut. If you would like to find your own deal like this, I do have an acquisitions boot camp. It's 8 weeks, one-on-one with me, and we try and find you a deal like this. So if you're interested, you could sign up for that below.